Welcome everyone, both in the room and out in Zoom land. I am Dr. Chiara Ferrari, Director of Faculty Development, and it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker and moderator tonight. Tonight's talk by Dr. Britt Wray is organized by the Office of Faculty Development, I would say proudly organized by the Office of Faculty Development and sponsored by the Office of the President. This event is an extension of last year's award-winning faculty learning community in teaching climate change and resilience, led by Dr. Mark Steeman. Mark is a professor in the Geography and Planning Department. He is also the inaugural Faculty Fellow in Climate Change and Sustainability, a new collaboration between the Office of Faculty Development and Jen Rotnam's Office of Energy and Sustainability. Both Jen and I are excited about working with Mark and about the possibilities that this collaboration can bring. So I have one housekeeping item to share before I introduce Dr. Wray. This talk is being broadcasted to all 23 campuses, 23 CSU campuses, and I want to welcome our colleagues at Chico State, even if virtually. There will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the talk for the guests in this recital, so we do not have an opportunity at home, but you can ask questions. But to simplify the audio demands and on the technical staff, there are no microphones for the audience. So all questions will need to be submitted in writing, and we have volunteers standing ready to distribute and collect those cards. A discreet hand raise will be enough. So let me get to our speaker tonight. Our guest tonight is Dr. Britt Wray. Dr. Wray is a human and planetary health postdoctoral fellow at the Stanford Center for Innovation in Global Health, Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment, and London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine Center on Climate Change and Planetary Health. And that is already a lot, but it's not all. Her research focuses on the mental health impacts of the ecological crisis. Dr. Wray is the creator of the Gen Dread newsletter, which invites us to stay sane in the climate crisis. And she's also the author of Generation Dread, Finding Purpose in an Age of Climate Crisis. The book was just listed this week as a finalist for Canada's most prestigious literary award, the Governor General Award, and is one of the 5 nonfiction books of the year chosen from across the country. So I'd say that congratulations are in order. Dr. Wray holds a Ph.D. in science communication from the University of Copenhagen and published her first book, Rise of the Necrofauna, The Science, Ethics, and Risks of De-Extinction in 2017. Next year, she will begin a new faculty position at Stanford's Department of Psychiatry, where she will lead a new special initiative of the Chair on Climate and Mental Health. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Britt Wray and Dr. Mark Steeman.
Hey, everyone. Thank you for that really lovely introduction.
Yes, thank you very much for those kind words, Chiara. And I also want to thank everyone, welcome everyone in the hall here tonight, and also everyone watching online. It is great to be here together tonight. Welcome, Britt. We have been talking, thank you so much for coming to Chico. We have been talking about this for quite a while.
You have made the warmest welcome I could possibly imagine. Thank you.
Well, thanks. You had quite a journey getting here, and I'm not talking about the drive from Stanford. You're born and raised in Toronto. Yeah. You got a Bachelor of Science in Biology a Master of Arts in Media Arts, and a Ph.D. in Science Communication from Copenhagen. You were in broadcasting for a decade. You started in pirate radio, by the way. I just love that. And then you spent a decade in broadcasting. You moved through all the capital letters, the CBC, the BBC, NBR, CBS. Your first book was on de-extinction, the bringing back of extinct species. I found it to be a really smart book, and it really seemed to flow from the past experiences that you've had. This book comes from a whole different direction. So let's just start there. Why did you write Generation Dread?
Well, you have seen that I just didn't want to join normal society, and I just wanted to continue being a student of all things art, all things media, all things environmentalism and biology. But throughout that period, of course, having a background in conservation biology, coming to terms with the sixth mass extinction was just part of my daily bread. Working as a science journalist, there was a lot of distressing information that I was taking in day to day, which is what frontline climate workers always do. And that was normal for me. I had been sad about it, of course, at times, and it would ebb and flow. But in 2017, it all came to a head in a really different way for me when my partner and I started considering whether or not we wanted to try and get pregnant. And this decision, while I had never before connected to the climate crisis explicitly, it wasn't something I was planning to introduce into our, future ideas of family, it erupted, and it was something that I could not ignore because all of a sudden it sat in my life as a huge dilemma as to whether or not I felt comfortable doing that, knowing what I know about the climate crisis and committing a new individual who doesn't need to be here to this warming planet, given the costs of historical inaction and what we are told will be unfolding if we don't dramatically curb our emissions. And the profound distress was something I didn't know how to really handle. There weren't terms for it. I couldn't hang my hat on it by reading different books that gave me references that made me feel less insane. And I needed to figure out what was going on within myself. I could use my science communication and journalistic skills to start probing. Was this just me, or was there a wider societal phenomenon going on? And what did this psychological impact of the climate crisis look like for other people? I discovered quite quickly that there was a frothing underground conversation of millennials, folks my age, and anyone younger, Gen Z, saying, a lot of us actually feel really uncomfortable with the idea of bringing a kid into the world. So that started getting normalized quite quickly. It's since become very much an overground mainstreaming conversation. We have tons of statistics to prove it. But that reproductive anxiety piece is just a tiny sliver of how the climate crisis has showed up in people's nightmares, in their stomach, and their guts, and their hearts. And it's far beyond just a technological, scientific conversation or that with which we speak to in forms of policy proposals. It's really settling in on this existential level, and I needed to discover all that I could to help my own coping, as well as help shed light on what this meant for all of us as we're moving further into this crisis. So in a way, I wrote the book that I needed to read because I didn't see any books out there that would help me at that time when I was really rattled. And what I discovered was deeply comforting, hugely psychologically nourishing, and gave me a lot of radical and active hope that I could believe in to be able to move towards more courageous climate commitment rather than get lost in a well of fatalism, which unfortunately is happening to a lot of people who sit alone with these feelings, which produces the sense of having the weight of the world on your shoulders.
In reading your book, it really is clear how much the research and the writing was very much a personal journey in all of this. And I really loved the personal reflections that you included. It really makes for powerful reading. I mean, many of your stories really resonated with me. I'm thinking of obviously having a kid, because I have a kid, but also your dad's party. That was a great story. Reading the book really also led me to, in some sense, re-examine my own teaching, which led me to be curious. What did you want to achieve in publishing this book?
A few things. I, at the most basic level, just wanted people who are feeling eco-anxious or riddled with climate grief to know that they're not alone, to have a mirror where those concerns could be reflected, validated, legitimized, to bring that understanding that this is not a pathology living within them, but it's a symptomology of a sick culture which is starting to breathe through them, and that this is something we can connect with each other over. So that was my first goal. The second was to address the mental health scourge that the climate crisis presents to youth writ large all over the world. We are just facing such an extremely horrific intergenerational injustice when it comes to what the climate crisis presents young people with, in terms of how it is now creating a huge sense of futurelessness, of hopelessness, oftentimes fatalism and despair that many young people will describe to you when you ask them, because a lot of young people today haven't been afforded time in life in which they haven't been aware of the climate crisis as part of the world's baseline, right? Young people today have known an inconvenient truth. They don't need to be reminded of the problem. They can speak it to you in their dreams. And it's done a lot to narratively foreclose their sense of the future, which is really goes against everything that is imbibed in what it means to be a young person. I mean, energetically, hormonally, biologically, when you're young, the future is about growth, adventure, exploration, figuring out new important aspects of your identity, and risk-taking. And when you're met with these narratives and this consistent barrage of bad news that's telling you we're in a code red for humanity situation, which is reminding you of potential extinction all the time, that is going against the force field of what you exist to do, which is expand and evolve. And that is hugely psychologically damaging, to have to confront that as a young person when most adults are not addressing that concern seriously. And it can be supported, and we can counteract that with the positive, nourishing stories and the truthful solutions that are also part of this big picture, but we haven't been doing that appropriately or responsibly as power holders or as adults or as a society. And so I wanted to be able to bring in that aspect too and outline their need. Just very briefly, my colleagues and I did a study of 10,000 16 to 25-year-olds last year in 10 countries around the world. We were looking in low, middle, and high-income settings from Nigeria, India, Philippines to the US, UK, France, and other countries in between. And when we asked these young people about their thoughts and feelings about the climate crisis, globally, 45% of young people told us that their thoughts and feelings about the climate crisis are negatively impacting their daily functioning. That's just being able to go to school, eat, concentrate, have fun, play, be in relationship, that sort of thing. So it really underscores how disturbing the situation has become and how much support is deserved. And I'd say, thirdly, a goal for the book is to advance or help advance a global conversation around the mental health impacts of the climate crisis writ large, because at a policy level and at the UN level, we need to take this seriously, and yet it was only the last IPCC report, the most recent one, that had the first mention ever of mental health within the climate context. So we're way behind. The research has been lagging, and yet we need resources to prevent traumatization and protect and promote mental health, because it isn't just that the climate crisis affects our mental health and can degrade our well-being in a variety of ways. It's also that how sound we feel, how resilient we are, how emotionally stabilized impacts how much climate work we can do, right? We can't be depleted as a social fabric and take on the massive task of overhauling all of the complex systems in which we're living as we move towards a greener economy. So it's bidirectional, and we need to talk about the co-benefits to our mental health and what that means to also benefiting the planet.
I think you said in the book, you quote, burned out people can't help a burned out planet.
Right, that's Susie Moser's quote. I love that one.
Right. Okay, so let's go ahead and dig in. You got this book. We're a front-running community to climate change. We had the Camp Fire in 2018. We had the Bear Fire the next year, just one ridge over. Yeah. Then last year we had the Dixie Fire, started in the same place but burned the other direction. And before any of the fires, we had the flood damage to the Oroville Spillway and the evacuation of 100,000 people in 2017. And it feels like all those people who fled in fear have come here. Midwesterners speak of tornado weather. I went to University of Iowa, and it's real, right? In Chico, we have fire weather. Hot, dry winds give me anxiety. So does walking across the dry creek bed through campus. Climate change is affecting my mood. So what's going on, and what do we call it?
There is an evolving vocabulary to describe what you're feeling.
Good.
Yeah. Yeah, helpful, right?
Yeah.
Turns out labeling things is really useful. There's this popular phrase in psychology, name it to tame it. It's actually super material to our ability to self-soothe with distress. So naming, having the accurate label is very powerful. Psychoeducation is key. But to get back to what you were saying, eco-anxiety has been described by the American Psychological Association as the chronic fear of environmental doom. Now, climate anxiety would just be a climate-specific form of that same response. However, when we use the term anxiety, it starts to introduce a sense of medicalization. Maybe it's a mental disorder. And there's a general consensus in the climate mental health field, though, that this is not a disorder. It's not a pathology. In fact, to feel this type of distress is a very normal response to an abnormal situation. And the distress is a set of challenging emotions which carry each of them important information about why we're feeling so chronically insecure in an escalating planetary health crisis, and then pointing out what shifts need to change to help us feel more secure. So it's adaptive, it's a constructive, practical form of anxiety. Therefore, it's not something you want to look at as catastrophic thinking or dismiss with a pill, right? This is about an unhealthy social situation that we must transform. There's also the term solastalgia, and this comes from the philosopher Glenn Albrecht to describe the homesickness we can have when we're still at home, because the environment that we once knew there has changed so much that we no longer recognize it and we can't access the solace that we used to. And so it's a very sad, melancholic feeling when your home is now this ghostly different space with a different spirit than what you were once attached to. And all of these types of emotions and terms belong to this other umbrella category that he named, which is psychoterratic emotions. Psychoterratic emotions are the things we feel from the earth itself. And so when thinking about that, what does it mean to be living on a vulnerable planet where the very life systems that we depend on are shifting and being disrupted and breaking down? We can feel the vulnerability of the animals. We can feel the vulnerability of people in frontline communities. We can feel the vulnerability of communities who have been living under the oppressive thumb of marginalization for centuries, dealing with environmental violences, and for whom all of us can now understand the stresses of. And for some, this is the first existential threat, but very much has not been the case for many communities throughout history who have been battling changing environments with the effects of colonization and genocide and all kinds of labels that we can look to in terms of how it's produced trauma, right? So in this sense, eco-anxiety could be reframed as eco-empathy. It can be a powerful thing to feel proud of when you understand that it's a sign of your care, it's a badge of your compassion, and elementally, an emblem of your humanity. So nothing to be ashamed of and nothing to pathologize. But of course, having said all that, we do have to be really careful because it can become so intense that it overwhelms a person's nervous system. It starts to really narrow their sense of possibilities for their own future, and the despair and the hopelessness and the depression can become too much. And we do indeed have cases of suicidal youth attributing that to climate anxiety. So it's not always practical. It can demand real mental health support, but overall, we can transform it when we understand it to be a super fuel for practical and constructive change, which AKA being climate activism.
When you say stolen nostalgia, I think of the Valley Tule Fog. I miss Tule Fog. We just don't get it with the warming climate anymore. So, our friend Sarah Ray, different spelling, is the one who introduced us. She's a professor at Cal Poly Humboldt, and she wrote an article for Scientific America titled "The Unbearable Whiteness of Climate Anxiety." In it, she asks if climate anxiety is really just a code word for white people wishing to hold on to their way of life, or to, quote, get back to normal. Now, to be fair, Humboldt, like Chico, is a fairly white campus. From your more international perspective, is climate anxiety just a white thing for the worried well?
It's a really provocative piece, and it's important to ponder what Sarah Ray is saying there. And it's true that only some of us are feeling how much the systems that we depend on don't care about us, are not protecting us with action. It's only some of us who are being presented with a sense of futurelessness or hopelessness. It's only some of us for whom existential threat is new, right? Indigenous communities, Black and brown communities, those living under authoritarian regimes, those dealing with human trafficking, I mean, we can go on, have long understood that the world is not safe, and so this is a tale as old as the hills. But many who are effervescently speaking up about climate anxiety or attributing this sense of being rattled only to the climate crisis may be new to this phenomenon and often are white, middle class, privileged, because it's them for whom it's new. And this was the case with me. I needed to understand that my lack of experience with existential threat meant that I had a lower reserve of existential resilience that was earned to rely on in this crisis. And I had to develop my own through a process of internal emotional activism and different forms of processing and really listening to and learning from communities who have long lived under existential threat as to how you cultivate joy in tough times and how you keep going and muster the courage and connection to improve your situation even when it doesn't feel hopeful, right? And so all of that is really important, and I take Sarah's point. However, when you look at the data, that's not what it tells us. This is not an issue for the worried well in isolation. And in fact, it's more pronounced often for the communities that have long been underserved. So we have data from the Yale program on climate communication that shows us in America, it's Black and Latino communities who are more alarmed and concerned than their white counterparts about the climate crisis, and also more likely to put their bodies on the line and take action, because they understand what's at stake. And it's already directly impacting their communities disproportionately compared to the privileged, often white ones. And when we go back to that global study that I mentioned in the 10 countries around the world that my colleagues and I did, although 45% of the 10,000 young people around the world said that they're having impaired functioning from climate feelings, when you looked in places where there was more exposure to climate hazards, like India, Nigeria, Philippines, that skyrocketed. Sometimes it was 67%. In other cases, 74% of the youth telling us that they had impaired functioning. And so we see that to live well with climate anxiety is kind of a justice issue in itself, because you need time and resources to be able to ponder what you're going through, educate yourself, develop the coping tools, reorient. When you're in a crisis and just surviving and trying to get through the day, you don't have time to pause and ask yourself, am I hopeful or hopeless, right? You just keep grinding and you do what you do, but it does take a toll. And so this is one more layer of collective trauma or distress on top of pre-existing forms, which is why it might not be called out in other communities. This is not the most immediate threat. It comes on top of systemic racism. It comes on top of economic insecurity or intergenerational trauma or whatever it may be. But it does affect anyone and everyone who can understand that their health is tied up with the health of the environment.
It's just powerful. Let's stay with that global survey that you and 8 other authors published in The Lancet, the world's leading planetary health journal, for those who didn't know. The title of the article is Climate Anxiety in Children and Young People and Their Beliefs About Government Responses to Climate Change, a Global Survey. Can you say a little bit more about it? And then specifically, what is institutional betrayal?
Sure. So we found some other really, those of us who are mired in this stuff as researchers day in, day out, were even a little surprised by how stark the findings were. 75% of the young people around the world told us that the future is frightening to them. 56% said that they feel humanity is doomed. 39% expressed hesitancy to have their own children as a result of the climate crisis. And there is a significant association between these negative thoughts and feelings and them saying that they felt betrayed by governments and lied to by leaders. And this is where we get into this concept of institutional betrayal. And that's when institutions that people are dependent on for their own security fail to uphold that responsibility. And it has psychologically injurious effect on those who have less power and can't do anything about it, to shunt those institutions towards upholding that responsibility. And so in the climate crisis, because we've experienced such, as has been referred to as predatory delay on action, cost of inaction, when we could have had a gradual centrist type of phase out over decades and haven't, and so now we're facing, no matter which way we cut it, we're facing loss, which is plenty worth grieving for, even though it's not the worst case scenario, even though there's still lots to heal and be hopeful about. We are in this experience of reckoning with the fact that we are now in the game of preventing more harm, but dealing with harms that are accruing and losses. And so that all comes into really psychologically damage young people who, as we already were talking about, are meant to grow, evolve, explore, and feel safe. And their ontological security is having holes poked through it every single day when they read the news. And they don't have that confidence that they're going to be okay and that everyone's going to be there for them, because they can't right now in this moment gather the confidence from looking at their institutions and witnessing them doing the right thing. So this also connects us to moral injury, which can happen by being caught up in a system that's transgressing your sense of what's right and wrong, or simply witnessing that happen. And so we are in a really interesting moment where young people are suing their own governments for failing to protect their future by not taking climate action, right? This is an expression of a belief that it violates human rights for children to have not acted, and that it is tantamount or paramount here to it is a form of child abuse, essentially. And we have the World Health Organization issuing reports saying that right now, because of the climate crisis and how it's been addressed, as well as the marketing of addictive products to young people, there's not a single nation on the planet that's adequately protecting children's health. So young people know this, and this is what's causing that sense of institutional betrayal, moral injury, but we can turn it around, and there's a lot we can do to fill in that vacuous hole with courage and commitment and solidarity and being the adults in the room, because right now young people feel like the adults have left the building.
One of the things I just love about your book is that you are very good at communicating the science behind a lot of these issues, science communication. So would you mind, for all of us, describing the psychology of denial that you detail in chapter 2 in your book?
Well, thank you. And yeah, this was something that I personally became so fascinated by, looking at what the work of psychoanalysts had revealed about why the climate crisis is so difficult for us as a society, as a species, to engage with. So we like to think of ourselves as rational creatures, that have this unitary self that knows all, sees all, and acts accordingly. But that's not at all the case. We're actually highly irrational. And we have multiple different parts of ourselves that act in accordance with different, aspirations and commitments. And so it's a way more nuanced thing than the outright climate denial that we're used to, which is where we've got, certain ideologies denying the existence of the greenhouse effect, or we've got the corporate malfeasance of the fossil fuel industry, where we know that they've been intentionally sowing confusion and doubt around their products and what it does to our health. Instead, there's many softer forms of denial that live inside all of us, and it's a result of these defenses that we each have that live in our unconscious and stand up to protect us from anxiety and pain. It's adaptive, right? We've all needed to lie to ourselves to get by when reality feels tough to bear. And so have all of our ancestors, right? It's been helpful. But in this scenario, it's been very perverse. It actually holds us back from taking on the actions that we need because we're so obsessed with staying comfortable, right? We're so designed to not be uncomfortable, or we dislike it so much that we will, without knowing it, fall victim to these defenses that keep us stuck at the cost of the future becoming terrifying, because they allow us to maintain the status quo while the crisis marches on. So one particular form of soft denial that's really prevalent is what's referred to as disavowal, which is, having one eye open to the truth and the other one simultaneously closed to it. So we read about dangerous tipping points in the climate system. We freak out and say, oh, yes, this is really terrible, and we ought to put all the best minds on it, put all the resources that we have towards it, and then simultaneously we close the other eye and we don't really believe that things so terrible will ever come to pass, and then we hop on the next plane, and then we don't say the thing that is bold and uncomfortable but needs to be said at the board meeting about our business practices or whatever, and continue. But we're being invited to get comfortable feeling uncomfortable in this crisis and finding ways of not being entrapped or ensnared by these defenses that are there to allow us to just, continue motoring on with as much comfort as possible. So another form would be negation. I mean, it's pretty absurd that we have developers trying to build condos at breakneck speed in the flood districts of Miami, and so on and so forth. There's different ways of pretending and certain, projects, whether it's construction in a flooding zone, helps us pretend that the climate crisis isn't happening, or commercials about big gas-guzzling trucks, allowing us to pretend that it's worth investing in a future filled with those things. So, yes, I certainly engage in a variety of forms of soft denial, and I'm always practicing how to get closer to noticing, be mindful of when I might be doing that. But really, it's too intense to have both eyes open to the crisis all the time. You will burn out. And so some conscious forms of suppression and compartmentalization can be really helpful, just so that you can get through the day and enjoy your life along the way and do other things than just focus on climate catastrophe.
Yeah, it's hard not to focus that way. We have that same soft denial up here. We build in fire zones. Instead.
Right.
We build up in the places that just burned. We'll go put houses right back where they just burned. So no to Valley's Edge, as we say this.
I mean, hey, I moved into a canyon in a redwood grove like 6 months after it had almost all burned down, so I get it.
Yeah. It's hard. So last semester, I hosted a faculty learning community with 65 faculty on 6 different campuses, CSU, representing over 20 different disciplines. Some of them may be watching out in the broadcast. One of the big takeaways from that FLC was that climate change anxiety in our students is real, and how we teach about it could be making it worse. We're currently streaming to all 23 campuses in the CSU right now, and I imagine we have a few faculty watching. I can look out there and see some of my colleagues here in the room tonight. What would you say to professors who teach about climate change?
I would say that too much emphasis is on describing the problem. It might feel like that's the job that needs to be done. That's what's in the curriculum, right? It's about getting the scientific evidence into the heads of our students, but they know. They know oh so well. And while it's important to not completely avoid the reality which distresses us, we need to go way more in the direction of describing the solutions that are real, right? Like promoting honest hope, focusing on the stories that are nourishing that we never get to enjoy, because as a culture, we are continuously ringing the alarm bells, trying to fact people over the head into action. And it's not working, and it hasn't been working. So why would it work now? Especially at this late stage in the climate crisis, when we need to bring about social tipping points where people can see themselves in this movement, have an authentic form of attachment to it, and know that their actions are going to matter, even though we cannot reconcile this crisis within ourselves as individuals. And so promoting that with a focus on the solutions, a focus on the community forms of care and the resilience building practices that we know from a variety of different fields is key, at the same time as really being able to empathize with them about the distress that they're experiencing, about why just doing your job as an environmental science professor could cause students to despair more, and understanding that they're angry, and it's totally understandable, right? Like the moral outrage is appropriate, and they might need an adult to take that seriously. And it could be you as a professor, because most adults in their lives have dismissed the importance of this crisis or lied about it altogether. So to be able to have a home, a relational home in which that emotion can be surfaced, could be really healthy, as well as other forms of challenging emotions. So being able to pierce the bubble of silence around the fact that this news carries this existential weight. People feel, really strained and stressed by it, and we can't continually deliver the science without addressing that. Therefore, shifting educational norms, talking about emotional coping tools, talking about mindfulness, meditation, yoga, gratitude, forms of community building, contemplative practices, things that have always helped humans coexist with difficult realities are needed in environmental science spaces. It's just that we separate rationality from emotions. And it's no longer appropriate. It can be healing, and it is necessary to bring them both together. So it's a time of listening to our students, asking them how they want to be supported, what kind of emotional skill sets they want in a scientific course, and then trying to work with our institutions to shift some of those curricular settings so that we can help the next generation of environmental science students come in, feel seen, be understood, validated, and then not burn out, and then not want to quit their programs, while always moving towards the solutions that are simultaneously real.
It was real helpful in our faculty learning community. We focused a lot on Project Drawdown, which really did help us get to the solutions that we were looking for. And I think that's something. So faculty out there, we do have a number of resources up on the faculty development website. I encourage you to check those out, and resources that you can take your teaching more positive in that direction. So thank you for that. This is so nice. I could sit here and talk to you for hours like this, but I'm going to stop. And I want to pass the mic to one of my former students, Kim Michael. So please come on up on the stage. As Kim makes her way up here, it'd be a nice time to collect any cards. If anybody wants any questions to ask, and you get a card. There you go. Kim graduated with honors degree last year and a degree in psychology. She was a student of mine in my Thought and Action class, and has been working with me at the South Chico Community Assistance Center, hosting climate cafes. She also read Britt's book, and she has a few questions of her own. So, Kim.
Yes, thank you for that lovely introduction, Mark. I am so excited to be here. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And as Mark just mentioned, I did just graduate, and I kind of want to start this interview by telling a little backstory. As you just mentioned, young people, a young person myself, we think a lot about the climate crisis and what that means to us. And it was in the last year of my degree that I really became conscious of how serious this crisis was. And I started kind of just talking about it constantly to anybody that would listen, including all of my professors. And I have a vivid memory of taking a biopsych class. And in this class, we talked about anxiety and depression and how these are adaptive mechanisms that help keep us alive. It's helpful for you if you live in an environment that's unsafe to be anxious or to be depressed. And so I kind of started to understand how these individual perils were really just symptoms of a larger societal sickness. But my professor continued on and talked all about the different medications that we use to intervene and mask over these reasonable reactions. And this realization made me very angry to know that that's how we were approaching this. And I started, visiting him after class and asking him things like, don't you think depression and anxiety are actually natural responses to the state of the world? And he would kind of shrug and laugh and say, oh, wow, you sound a lot like my sociology friends, which was not validating at all. And so I got even more angry that he wasn't using his power or his platform to address the root causes. And I felt really frustrated and helpless and betrayed and apathetic towards these institutions that I really used to admire and trust. So this is just one of many examples, and I tell this story because I have a feeling that a lot of students have similar experiences trying to bring up these really difficult conversations with the people that are in power. So in your book, after I graduated, Mark recommended your book to me, and I read it, and it was incredibly validating. There's a section where you unpack and kind of criticize the way we pathologize these reasonable reactions that many people feel. And it reminds me of the institutional betrayal and the moral outrage that we spoke about just a few minutes ago. So the climate crisis is really the elephant in the room everywhere. So my question for you is, what would you say to students who are feeling betrayed by their education? What do you encourage them to do?
Well, thank you. That anecdote is powerful, and I'm very glad that the book was validating. You're not alone. Students who feel this way are not alone. And there's a sea change coming. Like, the people everywhere are starting to sense this and understand it and move towards it. And so being able to connect with what is validating for you is key in the professors, in the schools and institutions, and the things that make you feel not gaslit, essentially. So being able to come together with your community and carve out what that looks like through organizing, like what you're doing with the climate cafes, for instance, is really important to be able to carve out ways in which you know you need to be nourished. There are many people that you can partner with. I mean, academics like Dr. Mark, myself, many advocates of young people. The whole climate movement is just so empowered by the support for young people, and get this distress as an important part of the entire pie that needs to be enjoyed together to foment a movement. So it's about stepping out of isolation every single time and coming together with others. Because we know from disaster studies, and when we're talking about acute trauma, from what we're really afraid of in the climate crisis, the damages that come into our families, into our close, intimate living spaces, we can get through all that. Humans are incredibly resilient, and we can do this when we have strong social ties, strong social connectedness in the places where we live. We can rebuild faster after bad things happen, and that sense of connection and belonging to a place, belonging to a community, is the antidote to the things that basically rip away our resilience and will be much more likely to result in mental disorder after an adverse experience like that. So even without being so focused on something acute happening, just generally, because we're dealing with cultural trauma, which is spreading, that piece is so key, and being able to, as young people, address it through your education is a wonderful place to start. But I feel like you could tell me about this. You're doing this work. The Climate Cafe concept is taking people all over the world who are talking about climate anxiety into a new space of processing and talking frankly about how this is showing up in their lives. So how is that going for you, and what have you learned?
Yeah, so I've been hosting these climate cafes for the last few months. For anybody that's not familiar, Climate Cafe came out of the Climate Psychology Alliance. I got my facilitator training done through the UK. And I have a background in psychology, but it's completely unnecessary. You don't have to be an expert in anything to facilitate these spaces, which I think makes it really accessible and decentralized. And what it really is a thinking and feeling space that is dedicated to talking about the climate crisis. It's based in a culture of care, meaning it's non-judgmental, it's empathetic. We, speak and listen from our hearts, and it's really action and commitment free. It's feeling orientated, which is actually a really good thing, and people have been really grateful and gravitating towards that because they're not being recruited to do anything. The Climate Cafe that I've been hosting at the center has ran at full capacity since it began, and I've done very minimal advertising, and I think that speaks to just the very high need for these spaces. Another really great thing is when we have these kinds of conversations, we get to practice talking about this taboo topic. We get to practice having these conversations in the everyday. We get to listen and speak from our hearts, and we get to build stronger community connections with people who are on the same page as us, who can validate and reflect back, like you're saying, these emotions that we're feeling. And in my experience, it has really been spaces like these that actually make the climate crisis bearable to look at. Going back to the cognitive barriers, when you're inundated with all this information and you're alone, it's impossible not to turn away. Like, of course you're going to turn away. So having that community support is a huge piece. And even though action is vital, we don't focus on it here. Inevitably, we do get to this point where we kind of need to act, do something. Emotions are the guiding force behind our actions. And when we sit with this information, and we know, the climate crisis to be true, but we're doing something else, and we get this cognitive dissonance, it becomes very uncomfortable. So there is a point where, once we do that internal activism, we confront our grief, we have integrated the knowledge of the severity of the situation, and we're ready to take the next step. Not everybody is an activist, so we don't want to point exclusively to activism. And it's going to look different for everybody, but is there a useful piece of advice you could share?
Well, yeah, I love the fact that you're focusing on the feelings without any expectation of outcome beyond that, right? Because we humans are very fickle creatures, right? We like to be the authors of our own story. We don't like to be prescribed a specific action. And often when you're coming into the climate space, you might feel like, oh gosh, okay, now I need to join Extinction Rebellion or the Sunrise Movement or 350.org, and I have to do X, Y, Z things, and then I'm a real climate person, which is a very limited understanding of what it means to be in the movement. Those things are all great, but it's not for everyone. Your climate contribution might show up in your therapy practice, in your art, in your working with school children, in your gardening, right? In the way that you are gathering with people in your community. And so having the open-endedness so that a person can process their feelings, integrate the difficult stuff so that they can tolerate and come to accept that, yeah, we really are in this severe of a predicament. And yeah, it's scary, but actually we can get through anything together. And then how am I going to courageously commit? What are my dynamics of engagement? Well, let me do that journey on my own, because whatever I'm going to author is going to be way more likely to stick if I come up with it. And there's a really helpful tool for doing that, actually. It's a Venn diagram. It was created by Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, who's a marine biologist and a climate policy person. And essentially, the question that everyone always gets is, what can I do? If you're a climate person, that's what you'll find that other people are asking you. What's the thing for me? What's my foothold? And no one can give you that answer. You have to find it yourself. But the Venn diagram gets you to move towards your answer by identifying in one circle, okay, what are my skills, right? My special superpowers. Am I really good at Excel sheets? Am I a comedian? Am I wonderful as a health worker? Am I a policy wonk? Whatever it is, identify your skill sets. In the second circle of the Venn diagram, what brings me joy? What are the things that get me out of bed in the morning? What brings me a deep sense of satisfaction and makes me grateful to be alive? You need to know those things, because that's the glue that allows the action to stick. You have to enjoy yourself. This can't be another obligation. The world is too tough for that. And then the third Venn diagram is looking at the work that needs doing. All of the places where the climate crisis needs attention and labor and commitment. And when you overlap those three things, this sweet spot of agency reveals itself in the center of where those things converge. And it's that path that you walk through, but you have to figure it out, and it can't be demanded of you, which is why these programs are so helpful, to help you move through the difficult stuff that otherwise might keep your action at bay because you continue to stick your head in the sand or disavow our reality, keep a distance out of self-protection. Once you've gotten there, then okay, you can start the process of reinvesting all that energy of being stressed out into actions that matter, which is how we purpose ourselves into this crisis, which is the best coping tool that there is.
Thank you for that.
Well, thank you for doing that work, and I'm so stoked for you that it's running at capacity. That's great.
Okay, so let's go ahead and I think we have time now to get some other questions, so let me go over. Okay, thank you. All right. So first question. Let me read the question first. Okay. What is the relationship between social media and eco-anxiety? How can we be mindful when using social media in regards to climate change?
The million-dollar question. Such a good one. Thank you. Yeah, so turns out our eco-anxiety gets spiked very easily in the age of doom scrolling. Anytime we open our devices, just this barrage, this torrential downpour of negativity. We have pretty powerful movements, the solutions journalism movement, to try and inject our storytelling space with the real solutions that are also happening. They're fighting the good fight of trying to inject their ethos into our media landscape, but of course that's not what we're usually experiencing, is it? It's outlining the threat, the problem. This is very good for engagement. We know that negativity is great for social media's general breakneck pace. And so it's profitable, and that's where we are, unfortunately, which means that it's then the responsibility of us as individuals to be very mindful of our digital diet and understand what we're paying attention to. There's a really brilliant quote, which I find just explains this better than anything I found, from the author and activist Adrienne Marie Brown. And she says, what we pay attention to grows. It's so simple. It's very true. So while we should not just turn away from the news completely, we have to make ourselves wide enough, capacious enough to pay attention to the other things, the things that bring us joy, connection, love, awe, wonder, entertainment, right? Silly stuff. All of that is valid and is what allows us to keep going and be multifaceted human beings in a crisis. And so, yeah, it's really important to maybe think critically about what apps you're using and how much time you're spending on them. Removing some of those apps for people who are in very spiky spaces of extreme eco-distress, that can solve a lot of problems pretty quickly. It's an easy SOS tool, is turning away from the news.
I want to piggyback on that because you brought up the idea of social journalism, solutions journalism
Yeah.
network. Do you want to say a little bit about it?
Oh, already did. Go ahead.
Okay, well, they are writing stories about everything that's going right. And one of the difficult things that I find in the classroom is when I talk about things that are going right, it's really hard to find stories about them. And so it's a great place to look. If you go to our faculty development website, you'll see the link to it. They also have a link connected to Drawdown so that every one of the Drawdown solutions has a story about it's actually being implemented. So it's another way to kind of bring solutions back into the classroom so they do it. And so my students have asked me, can we have one every day? So just give us a solution every day. That's what they asked for when I went back into class. And so
Right.
thought to be thinking. Here's another one. And this gets kind of into that same question you talked about before, is that what would you say to social awkwardness? The example of showing up at a birthday party with all the disposable plates, or at a talk about Generation Dread with plastic water bottles. What about gratitude versus trash judgment? Friendship with people who don't see it.
Gratitude versus?
Trash judgment.
Trash judgment.
What do you say in these situations that I think we all find ourselves in, right? We show up at a place that, you invited me over, you're being nice to me with this thing.
Yeah, I feel that this person wrote this question from within my own brain. Yeah, I know this. It's real, right? I mean, we are living in a time where we have to accept this incoherent, ambiguous situation that we are part of all the time, where none of this is perfect, and many of us are climate hypocrites, right? And it frustrates us, and we can see how we're fueling the fire that makes us feel unsafe, which is what makes us feel further destabilized by this. It's just maddening. But then we can also get a little righteous and project the blame onto others and notice it everywhere. And it is true. There's a lot of discrepancies. I was at a talk yesterday, and a guy was mentioning how being in the engineering world, and these guys focusing on the best electric batteries for the EV revolution and so on and so forth, and then they break at lunch and then they all go eat steaks. It's like, what? There are these inconsistencies that are all over the place, and it's important, I think, to be able to be compassionate with other people and compassionate with yourself, to not make yourself feel more insane about all of this, and recognize that we're in complex systems which make it very hard to be patron saints of recycling and never using single-use plastics. And we have family in far-flung locations, and sometimes maybe we're going to fly to see them or whatever it is. And rather than continually fuel the inner environmentalist critic that gets down on ourselves and self-lacerates from within, it's not helpful. It's really not helping anyone. Instead, to be able to own that incompleteness and ambiguity and say, all right, this is messy and it frustrates me and it's not perfect and I still need to do better, and we can all still do better, and work from that growth mindset, is how I've had to switch my own thinking on this. Because it brings about that just reminder, that barrage every time you order lunch at a lunch counter and then it comes in a styrofoam box. And then that starts triggering your eco-distress and so on and so forth. That's valid. It's okay to go there, but to notice that you're not alone in this. And actually, a lot of us can feel kind of as though we're the only tragic one who cares. And that's not the case. We are all feeling this, but it's a disenfranchised form of grief and anxiety, meaning we lack the social norms to talk about it, so we haven't been able to process it together, and that's what needs to change. We're in the business now of creating social norms where we can address this head on, and that can help us more productively move towards making the shift so that it's not a styrofoam container next time that we go to get our lunch, for instance. But we need to allow this distress to rise to the surface and meet it directly for that kind of work to begin or continue.
We have time for this one last one, and it follows along the same line. I think a lot of us feel that a lot of these decisions are being made above us, beyond us, big business, big government, corporations and such. And the question is then, how can we actually control and take the matter into our own hands and bring more of awareness to this crisis in our own lives?
Organizing. Organizing, and looking to the history of social movements and how what once seemed impossible became possible, right? Having the suffragette movement and women coming to be people and have a vote, and the abolishment of slavery, and so many other times when we have surpassed what at once was such a foreboding challenge. We're in that time again. It's a very auspicious time to be alive. This is a grand adventure. That kind of scary proverb, may you live in interesting times, right? That's us. So how are we going to rise to this occasion? Who are we going to be? Because whether we like it or not, what it means to be human has already changed as a result of the climate crisis. And so we have tools at our disposal. They lie in community. They lie in getting organized. It doesn't need to, we can't afford to wait around for power holders in society to do it. We all need to be part of this. And there's a lot of really exciting data, too, to show that it doesn't take a huge amount of the population to really cause a tidal wave of change and bring about the social tipping points that we need. And I expect that we're going to see some pretty radical change over the next few years to foment those social tipping points. We're having far more boisterous direct action on the climate crisis, which is growing in waves. We're having leaders from all walks of society understand this and get it more deeply. We're having this emotional outpouring because of the eco-anxiety, climate anxiety issue, where people are recognizing this and feeling it within themselves or hearing it from their kids. And that's starting to move people when it's a big issue of the heart. And so, yeah, I think these are all tools for us to use and to step into that opportunity of living in interesting times. But it always has been social movements and organizing where people with no special, unique privilege or power have been able to rewrite the course of what our species has done. and it's happening again now. So we just all need to play our part.
And I think that's a great way to end. Oh, you're going to try and ask a question right there? Okay, you're just fist up. All right, there we go. This has been so wonderful. I want to thank you for coming.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for having me. Thanks, Kim.
I also want to thank everyone, for all of you, for coming, but we're not done yet. There is going to be a reception outside, so I please stay. And Britt's going to be signing books in the foyer, so go ahead and do that. Before we leave, I really want to thank Chiara Ferrari and Rebecca Nelson from Faculty Development over there. For all their wonderful help and for the food outside. So be sure to thank them for that as well. I also want to thank Stephanie Juncker, Carmen Gomez, Robert Wiesling, and Morgan Schmidt. These are all the people you don't see because they're all back there running this thing. And so they put down wonderful shows. So thanks for everyone who made the production possible. And one last shameless plug. If any student out there wants to take the class that Kim mentioned, I'm teaching Thought in Action Monday, Wednesdays at 4 o'clock on this spring. So thank you much for that. With that, let's go enjoy each other's company.
And one last thing, I will stick around also if anybody wants more information about the climate cafes that we've been hosting monthly, come talk to me.
And one more last thing, we're going to do one for faculty. So if you want to do that, talk to me after that. And with that, unless you have something else.
I don't.
All right, thank you very much.